Okay, Tanya Roth, thank you so much for joining me. It's great to see you.
Good to be here. Thanks.
Your book caught my attention because it touches on so many of the things we try to talk about on this program, particularly everything that's happened after World War II.
The best
Um,
time.
yeah, right. I think I've heard you say like it's the we've been living in like the sequel, an elongated sequel to that era, and it sometimes feels that way. I live in Southern California, so the World War II is sort of has a particular presence here. But your book, I want to say before we even get started, I want to say the name of your book. It is called Her Cold War: Women in the U.S. Military, 1945 to 1980, and it is out right now from the University of North Carolina Press. This covers, I'm so glad you're here because we talk about that in the popular imagination. I feel like in like kind of Forrest Gump sense, the role of women in this post-war story is often reduced to sort of like, well, women were the Rosie the Riveters who worked in the factories during the war, and then after the war, they were sort of relegated back to the domestic sphere. But what you're picking up is a story of women in the U.S. military that's a very different kind of vision of women in this period, but also seem connected to those other stereotypes, right?
It really does. I think that you've got this story kind of going simultaneously, and um, sometimes they're overlapping groups of women, sometimes they're the same, they're totally different groups of women, but it's a story we just haven't spent much time looking at.
Mm.
I think for so long it was this focus on World War II, which is huge and important, but what comes next?
Right. And I mean, there's also just in our time, I mean, growing up in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, there's like the idea of women in the military had a different kind of a different set of vision, different ideas connected to it, particularly combat, right? Like I was thinking that
Absolutely.
was the story that we were introduced to.
Exactly. That was the whole debate. And now I think back on the visibility of women in services the last 20 years. I feel like we've gone from like, oh no, women in combat. And now I think the rhetoric's changed when the US pulled out of Afghanistan and there were the attacks on or the deaths in the US military. I believe there were several women killed. I'm afraid I don't know their names. But I was looking to see if that narrative would be spun about, oh no, women in combat. I just didn't see that story anymore. So I feel like
Mm.
our not to say that women in combat are fully accepted today, but I think we're definitely seeing evolution from where it was in the 80s and 90s for sure.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking about how much. I mean, it's sort of an awful time in terms of public discourse about gender.
Yeah,
In terms of just what's going, but you don't see the military. I don't. I feel like I don't feel that military angle as part of the panic that's going
no,
on about gender right now.
no,
Yeah,
I think you're right.
that's interesting. So we can I want to orient people in time here because your book takes on a very particular moment in the history of the American armed services after World War II. And I'm sure a lot of people know this, but maybe a lot of people don't, that in 1948, something called the Women's Armed Services Integration Act was passed. And can you explain a little bit of what that was about and what it did? Because it seems pretty important when we're
Yeah,
talking about uh, the ideas about how women fit into the military. Yeah.
that is the whole starting point, and that's where honestly everything takes off from 75 years ago this June, as the war was. I mean, the war in our imagination is done in 45, but the drawdown of troops and returning them home took a lot longer. And in those couple of years, as things were going, there were people working behind the scenes, including General Eisenhower, who was not yet president, leaving the army in the years after the war and heading to Colombia, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
And but he's one of the proponents, along with several women who had served during World War II, and they all said, "Look, we need women in order to be ready for the future. We don't need to just give this to the work of men. Sure, combat for men. That's everything they would have said is leave the combat to the men. But women can do all these jobs in a modern army or navy or the Air Force came out in 47. They just said we can do this. So let's keep women. Let's you don't have to have as big of a draft if you keep women, and they push it through by just a prayer of a chance, pretty much.
I wonder what are the politics of that? Like why this moment? Why in 1948? I mean, is it it seems like a progressive moment, right? I think, but it also seems kind of like, I don't know, strategic in some way too, right?
I think so. And what's really interesting, and this is where, as I was finishing the book, I had to go back and take a look at the logistics of Congress in that period because, when you get the Roosevelt administration, you have 4 terms of a Democratic president and a majority Democratic House and Senate. I might be misspeaking on part of it in those years, but for the most part, hugely Democratic holdings overall. And when you get to the 80th Congress in 1948, they called it the Do Nothing Congress because the party affiliations switch. You have more Republicans in play, and they're not interested in the same agenda as before. They're interested in the military, and so in the fall of 47, you get the creation of the Department of Defense, and the Air Force is a separate organization. But the House took up the Women's Armed Services Integration Act in the spring of 48, and they're like, not quite loving this. We don't really like how this is looking, and they wanted to revise it to be a little more conservative. Let's let women in the reserves only. They could see a justification for that. Like, sure, if we have Americans who are willing to serve their country, and if we're clear on the fact that they're not going to be anywhere near combat, then why not? Let's let women run the desks and let's let them do the office jobs and other things that women can do. And why not? But let's just make them reserved to reinforce that. And a couple people stepped up and said, nope, if you either need these women or you do not. Margaret Chase Smith, who was a Republican representative from Maine, who'd taken over her husband's seat at some point, she was a huge advocate. She said, look, you either have to do this or don't do this. And with some work with the Senate and reconciling them, they came back with, all right, let's just do it. And I think maybe a lot of them thought that they wouldn't get a lot of women in there. And they also probably thought that the limitations they placed on the number of women and the roles going to probably keep them pretty safe from too much woman power taking over the military.
Yeah, I wonder like what is, I mean, obviously there's this social role that that there's a fear of being lost here, right? And I wonder sort of what is the language about that, because it sounds like, there's this real like skepticism, like we'll let women in, but we're going to put like careful barriers around sort of what roles they play. I'm assuming like how far they can rise into leadership positions
No,
and things like
exactly.
that. I mean, it seems like you're very much like announcing that women will be second class citizens within the military. It's just sort of it's sort of mind boggling how that balance is struck, I guess.
It is. They, from their perspective, they really thought they were creating equal place for women in the services. They had equal ranks and equal pay. So if you were a private, whether you're male or female, same pay, right? Not that it's going to be a lot of money, but it's going to be the same. That said, you could not rise above the rank of colonel in the Army or the Air Force, I believe commander in the Navy, because they figured women would never become generals or anything higher than that. No admirals would be women, not at all. And their theory was, okay, we need a colonel so that they or commander so they can oversee the other women, and we need some women in officer roles, but for the most part, we don't really need that many women up there. But the conversation that was starting to happen by 48, what I think pushed the bucket over is that they're starting to look again at selective service and universal military training. And in the aftermath of the war, I think if they had said no to women altogether and then started drafting men in just the next couple of years, which they did, but I think that if they bypass women altogether, they thought they probably would have had a little blowback. So
Mm.
it seemed like, well, we can keep this practical level, and there's probably not many women anyway. But everything reads as women will be equal with men. They will have everything equal except rank, and you have to have no more than 2% of the military could be female at any time. Um, on top of that, like because they're not going into combat, they can't get hazard pay. There's certainly ways in which the pay was not totally equitable, but for the most part, it was meant to be. And they really thought. I focus on it as in terms of difference feminism. This idea that they recognized men and women were biologically different, and if they used women in the best ways that women could be used and use men in the best ways they could be used, which meant, all of us work in combat, then that would be equality. We will find the best places for women to support the military and the best places for men, and everything will be good.
How does that, how does that fit into the larger kind of like Cold War culture that's happening here? Because obviously the Cold War, when we say that term, it's like there are a lot of eras to it. Obviously, is it the Reagan Cold War or is it the Eisenhower Cold War? But with this happening in 1948, the Cold War is sort of being constructed in 46, 47, 48, right around there.
Yeah.
So how does that fit in? Because again, I feel like the very Ken Burnsian notion of women during this era is that women are expected to be homemakers and are very much associated with kind of motherhood and a domestic role as we bring the country back together after the war. But there's this other story going on with the military
Yes.
too. Yeah.
So a lot of it is they are assuming that most of the women who come in will be young unmarried women. So if you are not getting married right out of high school, and a lot of women were at that time, but if you were looking for a job for a few years before you become a wife and mother, here's a great place that parents, it's a safe job for your daughters. Uncle Sam will look out for her. She'll become a good patriotic woman. We'll make her into a better lady. They never use the words finishing school, but the way they advertise it, especially in the early 50s and into the 60s, there is a big air of, hey, this isn't that different from what maybe 50 years ago young women of a certain class might have gone through to get ready for marriage. The Army's not going to teach you how to set a meal for your husband at 5 o'clock and do the vacuuming, but it's going to teach you to be a patriotic mother, which always kind of reminds me of Republican motherhood during the American Revolution, which takes us way out of the Cold War, right?
Yeah.
But I think that patriotism absolutely is key there, that we are going to take this young generation of women who weren't old enough to serve in World War II, but now they're hitting the age of 18, 19, 20. How can they be patriotic? Well, here's an opportunity for them to become patriotic, just like their brothers or their cousins and so on. And they create ways to make it easy for women to then become wives and mothers. So if you get married, at least at first, you could apply for a discharge based on marriage. Got a little tricky during the Korean War. They had to put a stop to it because a lot of women were getting married and saying, oh, I'm going, bye. Pregnancy was definitely the big one. If you became pregnant, if you had a miscarriage, if you married somebody and became a stepmother with children in your house more than 6 months of the year, you're out. So that was their very fine line until the 1970s, that we're going to reinforce this idea that women should be wives and mothers. We recognize there are other things women can do before that time, and here's an option.
Wow. So once you're a mother, you're not part of this
You're
anymore.
done. Wow. Totally done. Yeah, there's in the early 50s.
Well, that answers my question, because I was kind of like, what resolves the tension is that sort of like, well, we separate these things. That's amazing. Wow.
And there are women who push back. They're rare, but about each decade until you get to the 70s, and they finally decide, okay, we got to change this. In the early 50s, a woman who had been in World War II and then was in the reserves after the war, she had a young son. She could translate like 5 different languages and had served in the Far East. And they're like, you got to go because you have a child. And she went to Congress and like, yeah, no, sorry, you're out of luck.
Yeah. God, this whole idea of like the U.S. military as an arena for social change seems like it's a key thing going on in your work. But I wonder just how much that's like. It is social engineering, right?
It kind of is.
How much of this is connected to like the public conversation at all, right? I feel like there's on the one hand there's the government like sort of creating these programs, but I wonder, how that fits, because I don't think of this as a feminist moment. I think right,
it doesn't feel like that. And the women who are at the highest levels throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s, many of whom served in World War II and then just continue on. I think one of the best examples is Chidi Home, she was in the Army during World War II, joined the Air Force when that opened in the late 40s, and went on to be the first 2-star female general in the 70s. She wrote a fantastic work cataloging the entire history. And she's like, she was probably the most feminist of all of them, and probably wouldn't have called herself a feminist. Most of them, even in the 70s, said, no, we're not feminists. We are thinking practically. They're totally feminist by how we would define them today. But they're trying to play into the rhetoric because they want it to be acceptable for Americans. They want parents and young women to, they want the right kind of girl, so to speak. They want the girl who is sexually pure, who's not looking to join the military to get a good time with men across the row. They don't want lesbians to join because
Mm.
that's not appropriate in the military at the time. So they're really envisioning they want the best of American womanhood, and they want to buy into that rhetoric right there.
It's a very narrow
It's
vision,
very
though, of like
narrow.
what a woman is. Yeah.
What's interesting, though, is thinking of social engineering. So June 12th, 1948, I believe, is when the act is signed into law. 6 weeks later, Truman signs Executive Order 9981 to desegregate the military. There's no way he could get Congress to support legislation to desegregate the military. So he desegregates it. What's really interesting is that timing effectively means women's Air Force was never segregated. Women Marines not segregated after World War II. None of the women's services really were segregated after World War II. There's a little holdover until the early 50s, but you have in the barracks in North Carolina at the Marine Corps training station, they're putting white and black women in the same hall and trying to figure out how to live these women side by side. How well are they grappling with issues of race? I don't know. I don't think wonderfully, but they're certainly giving opportunities for Black women that did not exist elsewhere for sure.
Mm. God, it makes me. It's funny bringing up the Revolutionary War and the sort of like longer history of this because my image of I'm thinking about like the Civil War, and the sort of like Thomas Nast images, and other like lithographs and prints about women during that era. I mean, so much of it is either like women represented as the family, like this is the reason why the Civil War is being fought, we can
Yeah.
reunite the family. But then there's also like when we think about war and women, it feels like nurses are like a common image, right? And with
Yes.
World War II as well. And I guess I'm kind of wondering about that transition from like that. I don't know. You can get as American studies as you want with this stuff, but it feels like there's something going on with that kind of nurses in the military image as a like bringing the maternal, bringing the domestic into
Absolutely.
the caretaking into the military. And it seems like this Integration Act in 1948 is something wider than that,
I think
right?
so.
Yeah.
And the numbers never get very large. When the Korean War starts, they have a really big concerted campaign, and they just really can never get there. I don't think it's really till the 70s that they start seeing the numbers that they wanted, which probably speaks
That's
to the time.
interesting. Yeah.
It is really interesting. That said, when I did my some oral history interviews over the years, a lot of women told me I couldn't afford to go to college. My parents couldn't send me. The military was the thing to go, or the place to go. So it did for a lot of women just become an opportunity. But a lot of them also just serve for a year or two or get out. We don't have a lot of women who have long lasting careers in the military. A number of them, but just not huge numbers, which is not uncommon. I don't think. I think you think of Korea and Vietnam, a lot of the men are just doing a couple of years stints and then getting out too. But women are doing it by choice.
Mm.
I think the nurses do still get more of the attention because there's more of them. And there's certainly more of them serving in Vietnam and in Korea, whereas non medical women would be more. There's certainly some in Japan, in Okinawa, but not serving in country, maybe a couple in Korea, but that would be mostly the medical corps.
And what about the whack, right? When does that start, and how is that attached to this
Yeah.
integration period?
So WAC stands for, it was first the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, the WAAC in 1941, early, well, 42. I always say 41, but I forget Pearl Harbor's December.
Right,
So
right.
42 was the WAAC, and by 43 it became just the Women's Army Corps. That was the moment when they took it, and as the WAAC, they've been kind of serving alongside the military, but they weren't in the military. And during the war, somebody said, look, we can't do this. It doesn't make sense. We have two different structures. It's not effective. And they put women in the military. But with the Women's Army Corps originally, every legislation admitting women to the service during World War II said this is for the duration of the war plus 6 months. That's it. And then you have to disband. So after the war ended, the Women's Army Corps was the only part of the services after 1948 to keep that name. That they were actually the Women's Army Corps. They were full on
Mm-hmm.
called division. It's probably the easiest thing in my head. I'm sure there's a better name. Um, that sticks around until 78 when they get rid of they dissolve all of these. So there's a director of the Women's Army Corps. They have a separate Women's Army Corps base, etc. Functionally, once you were out in the field, I don't think it really mattered in your day-to-day job, but for training purposes and leadership, formal organized corps. The Navy still called themselves the Waves, which was their World War II moniker, but they were not a separate organization. By the 70s, the woman who was called the director of the Waves was like, that's not my title. I'm the Assistant Chief of Personnel for Women in the Navy. So they didn't even have that structure. And the Air Force, they were always called WAFs, or Women in the Air Force, but not a Women Marine, same thing. But none of those three branches had the same separate structure that the WAC had. That
Interesting.
lasts a
Yeah.
long time.
Yeah. I mean, I have so many questions. I mean, one of them is just like, at what point do women have guns in their hands? You know, like that's kind of,
Yes.
that seems like to me, just kind of my, the big thought in my head is like, when does that line cross?
Well, it's funny because they cross it in the 50s, then they take them away and give them back in the 70s. So there's some accounts, some records from about probably before 55. I think by 55 they get rid of them. But in women's training, they did bivouac training, and there's articles that show women standing with pistols and doing pistol training and carrying them out to the bivouac. But then somebody at some point is like, that's not a good idea. So they took it away. There might have been a few exceptions. I can't remember. I know I've encountered like women as military police. I can't remember when that comes in or how that worked. But definitely, once they get rid of the Women's Army Corps itself in the 70s, that's when guns and camo and the women, as we think of them today, really come into being.
That so okay, so that's like a 70s moment. That makes
Yeah.
sense. And now I'm just kind of wondering, how how this is being conceived of in this sort of like left wing counterculture explosion that includes second wave feminism in the 60s. Like I don't think of that. I'm trying to kind of square like what's the attitude towards military service there, because so much of it is
Yeah,
tied to like the anti-war movement, right? And like,
exactly.
yeah.
So I think it really the initial support for service women, because they're already there, right? They're already in there, and it takes a while for civilian women feminists to notice this. So there is an organization from 51, it still exists today, the Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Services, or DACOWITS, which is a great name. So DACOWIT's entire mission, it was civilian women, and they partnered with military representatives to figure out what do service women need, what do we do to make women's service better, how do we make this more effective. Today they're dealing with questions about like how do we support nursing mothers and uniforms and other medical needs around motherhood, which were not questions they were asking in the 50s or the 60s. That group is the first one to start trying to address issues that feminists were also starting to address. What happens in the early 60s is Kennedy has the President's Commission on the Status of Women. And that happens to bring together a couple of women from Dakowitz and a couple of high-ranking civilian women, and they just start talking service women. And they do a couple big things behind the scenes that push towards getting rid of those rank restrictions. But it really isn't until about the early 70s that women from the National Organization for Women start to pay attention. So really, in the 70s, that's when they see more and more of a push. I think what starts happening is as restrictions are ending, so they end rank limitations in 67 under Johnson. And then by the early 70s, they're starting to push back on pregnancy. The ACLU starts to take a notice of what's happening for pregnant women in the military. Now starts to take a look. I think some women maybe start getting rejected from the services for various reasons. Women start thinking about the military academies, and they're not allowed there yet. So those issues start fomenting and coming to a head. And that's when civilians are really starting to look and go, oh, hey. But I do think that Vietnam and the draft and that rhetoric does distract from it for quite a while, that we're not really going to pay attention to these women who are not nurses, who are just doing routine jobs and are in there because of their choice. So it's really interesting to watch how that shifts.
Yeah, I mean the rhetoric is so divisive. It seems like some women are gonna and some people are gonna say, oh, a woman joining the military, how is that feminist? Because that's
Yeah,
just joining the imperial war machine, you know. Whereas the other side would say, well, at the same time, like these issues of equality we're talking about, and the military as a sort of state institution mobilizing that is important. And
exactly.
it's part of a long history of those social changes happening that way too.
Yeah,
It's hard to balance. It really is.
it is. It really is.
How did you strike on this topic? How did you decide to write about women women after World War II and the because I mean it's such a rich topic and
It's
one
so
that like
great.
yeah.
And and when I started it years ago, there's sort of the sense that like there's not going to be anything there. I was like, oh, I bet there's something there. I don't remember who said that. So I always had very supportive mentors and advisors. But as an undergrad, I did on a whim. I wanted to do a thesis, and you had to take an undergraduate seminar. I'd never taken gender history. The only thing that looked interesting that fall was gender in World War One. I was like, okay, sure, whatever. First day of class, the professor says, okay, what do you want to do your topics on? I had no clue. I didn't know anything about how to pick a topic or do research. And she assigned us Vera Britton's Testament of Youth, which is her account of serving in World War One. So maybe nurses in World War One. So I
Mm.
ended up writing about volunteer nurses who were not really nurses, but high class women who had 6 weeks of first aid training for most of them. And after that, I finished my undergrad. I got a job. I kept thinking about graduate school, and I was just like, what happens next? And somehow, early on in grad school, I had this sense that, well, there's a lot of World War II stuff. What happens after that? And literally, in my first year, the Women in Military Service, or the Women's Memorial, it's called that now, the Women's Military Memorial in DC, they published a book called A Defense Weapon Known to Be of Value. It's got quotations around the title,
Hmm.
all about women in the Korean War period. And I literally got access to that my first year. And that turned me on to, I think they mentioned the Women's Armed Services Integration Act. I started digging, and nobody had talked about this. And then I just kept digging, and it just never disappeared.
It's also a wing of military history,
Yeah,
right? I mean, we talk a lot about American history on this show. I mean, I've talked to a million historians, mostly Americanists. But can you tell me a little bit of like military history as because it's such a particular wing of history,
it really
right?
is.
Like
Yes.
and I part of me is always like, wow, that's a lucrative wing. Like that's the place that's always strong. Like the military historians are always finding jobs in government agencies and private institutions and things like that. But it does it I guess part of me was kind of like I wrote about the anti-war movement and like kind
Yeah.
of like the counterculture and all that kind of stuff. And I felt weird sort of like being in military history because it seems like there's a connection to the military in many cases, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. There was interesting politics to that.
It really is. I think that similarly to the anti-war movement, when you occupy the space of women's history overlapping, it is military history, as you said, but it's not. It's social history of the military, and that takes a different view than, say, grand operational strategy history, which is the more when I think traditional military history, I think about like where do you put your tanks and where do you put your
The
troops
History
and
Channel
the
stuff.
History Channel, yes.
Yes.
And like I have students who come in, I teach high school, and a lot of my ninth, 10th grade boys will come in and be like, oh, and they'll name some plane. I cannot tell you any planes or any tank. Like, that's not my forte, but I can tell you about how the military is operated as an institution. Um, I was really lucky in graduate school because of this overlap. I got to do it's defunct now and somebody else has picked it up the West Point summer seminar in military history, and that was 3 weeks of like hardcore military history. And I learned a whole lot. Really helped orient me to the institution much larger. And as you said, so many people get great jobs in government organizations and other roles. And I, I still sort of feel like I have this odd space, but it's military history, but it's definitely like military. I can tell you how the people in your institution operate, right?
Right. It's a
That's what's
little
interesting.
yeah, it's a little subversive or it's a little I don't know, it's different than the kind of military history that we think of.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that's tricky. I experienced the same thing because I've been on I did part of a staff working on museum exhibitions about like the Vietnam War. I'm there, with all these military historians, and I'm kind of like, I feel I've often felt out of my element, and that especially it's daunting and intimidating to encounter all the ranks and encounter the hierarchy and try to learn the waters of kind of all of this language, because it is, I mean, you talk about all those acronyms. The military
Oh
is
my
just like
gosh,
the
yeah.
most bureaucratic institution in the world.
It is.
It's hard to navigate all that stuff. I don't
It
know.
is. So it's kind of nice to be on that fringe. And I've been in conversations with a KU Center for War, Society, and Military. I'm going to get that name wrong. But I did a piece for them recently. It just came up today, ironically, about I guess I'm in that conversation of how do we expand what we think military history is. That it's not just the tanks and the battles, although those are interesting, but I can't teach traditional military history and the stuff that I teach, but certainly I teach a lot of stuff that involves the military. And I think at the end of the day, what's really interesting about the military is not about how we make strategic plans to attack this place or this place. But I think it's really interesting the people who are in that. So who are the
Yeah.
people? How do they make these decisions? And how do we as a country shape that institution? And how does that institution shape us?
Oh yeah. I mean, it's like thinking about college or higher ed, I
Yeah,
mean, I think that's it's sort of like there's a lot of parallels to me. It's sort of like, people who are embedded in these institutions, you sort of like you become aware of kind of how much this stuff structures your reality.
yes.
Yeah, I think about like our students too. I mean, you teach high school. I want to hear what high schoolers think about this, because I mean, I've taught college for years, and many times when I've done classes about war, military stuff, I'll ask my students, did any of you consider going into the military? And I mean, it depends on what school I'm at, because some of these like elite private schools, no, none of the students
Yeah.
consider it at all. And then other times I'm teaching at a community college of working class students, and like several of them are like, I might join. I am already. I was in the reserves, etc. They have much more kind of experience with it. The class divide is pretty heavy with
It
that stuff.
is.
Yeah.
And I'm at an elite private school. So I don't think I know any student who has just gone straight from here to the military, but we do get a couple kids every year. I know a student who's trying to get into one of the academies. So we usually get a handful of kids who are trying for the academies each year. I have a couple of former students who are Navy Academy grads. I don't have any close ties with them, but so that seems to be what we see is a few of those kids who go for the academies more than anything else, which is
Yeah. I mean,
fascinating.
the question to me is always kind of like, why did you consider or not consider the
Yeah,
military as an option? I mean, the answer I get most often, honestly, and I don't know if this is your experience, is family. Like people say, like, oh, my parents would never allow that for me, or they say, oh, my parents really wanted that for me. Yeah.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Every year we have for Memorial Day, we have a Memorial Day assembly, and they put together in our alumni office a really beautiful, huge thing. It's 2 pages, it's not thick, but photographs of all the alums, because our school, it was formerly two separate institutions, a girls' school and boys' school. And I don't think, to my knowledge, I don't think we have any women who ever joined the military until probably the last 30. I would say probably not until after the 80s. I would love to find out how many grads we have who are women at West Point or whatever. I don't think a whole lot. But we have 2 pages of photographs of young men who absolutely joined up in World War II and Vietnam and Korea. Maybe they were drafted. I'm going to guess probably not, given their class background. My guess is that these were men who made that choice, but I don't know what that would look like today, right? Because
Yeah.
our young men and women are not choosing that.
Well, I mean, I think the economy will often determine that,
Yeah,
honestly, right? I
yeah,
mean, I mean, the military is, I mean, I guess that speaks to a little bit of how much the military is like college, in a sense of like it's a place
true.
where people go to kind of like be taken care of a little bit, if that makes sense. I don't know if that's the right word.
Exactly. No, I think
Yeah.
that makes sense, especially we got that sense that maybe you can get some direction there or
Access,
signing bonus.
yeah, access money, honestly. Like,
Exactly.
uh-huh. I mean, you know this better than I do in terms of like how the military has pitched itself over the years. But I mean, we grew up with kind of like sign up and get $30,000 for college, and it was always like
Yeah,
college and military were sort of like the two paths, and they were often like the same path, if that makes sense. Yeah.
I think so. Yeah, that's
Wow.
definitely since the end of the draft, they had to find a whole lot of new ways to attract men and women to the military. I think that became a really huge one.
I want to know. Okay, so we have this 1970s moment where I often think about the 70s as the moment where a lot of the feminist rhetoric of the 60s becomes in law and in the structures of society much more present. But there's also this backlash happening. I know there's like Susan Faludi book Backlash about the 80s, and there's a conservative movement happening, and gender is a part of it. And there's, I mean, I'm thinking about Reagan and AIDS and the evangelical movements, and I mean, just there's a lot of that going on. Where are women in the military in that world? Because that's sort of like we were. I mean, I remember the Reagan 80s a little bit. I was a little kid, but it was like a lot of conservative and a lot of Christian
Yeah,
rhetoric, and seems like that intersects with women in the military one way or the
it
other.
does. Like the 70s seems so full of promise that as the Equal Rights Amendment starts winding its way through Congress, people in the military are like, oh, we should really see how this is going to affect us. And they get on board, and that leads to, okay, we'll open up military academies to women. So by the time Reagan gets into office, they've already had the first class of women graduates by the spring of 1980, which is great. But there's this whole period. I love the name of it. They call it woman pause in the 80s because
Wow.
woman pause. They're literally
Okay.
trying to say, let's stop putting women in the military. We don't need them. And
Oh
yet there's
my God.
operations in Panama and other places where there are women. Or Goldie Hawn's movie. Oh, and so have you seen the Goldie Hawn Private Benjamin? What year was 1980? Goldie Hawn does Private Benjamin, which is
Yep.
total slapstick and not realistic at all. But I mean, and that's right before all this happens. And then I feel like there's this jump from Private Benjamin to Seymour movie in the 90s where she joins the
Oh, GI Jane.
yeah, Jane. That's it. We got
Yeah.
this huge gap,
Right.
right? Of like
Right.
16, 17 years or so. Women are still there, and we've got them in higher ranks than ever before because by the 80s, you got two-star generals in at least one of the branches, if not more. So they're kind of slowly feeding their way up, and nothing's really happening. The Gulf War, the first Gulf War, that leads to changes in what women can do in terms of flights and combat. There's this moment of we can't deny they were there. They were doing important stuff. Why do we have these restrictions? And they're getting down to the nitty gritty. Like, does combat include like pressing a button on a missile that's going to go 1,000 miles away? Kind of like a drone today, right? If you're
Right.
flying a drone, is that combat? And they're starting to think through that. So, and then of course, when Clinton does Don't Ask, Don't Tell in the 90s, we start seeing that shift again after, I mean, after Desert Storm, people start talking again about women in the military and gender in the military.
Yeah, I was just thinking about Don't Ask, Don't Tell. What a weird moment because that's 90s too,
So
right? You
weird.
have GI Jane, and this sort of like tough movie, action movie about with Demi Moore, yeah, with her shaved head. It was I feel like it was a big moment culturally,
Yeah,
GI Jane, right? And
yeah,
then but also Don't Ask, Don't Tell is happening, which for people that don't know, this was like the Clinton administration's weird sort of like half measure to deal with gay people in the military, just basically the child strategy of putting your fingers in your ears and saying la 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 la, and it doesn't
exactly.
so I still think, I mean, Don't Ask, Don't Tell sounds so silly to me,
It does.
and not a way of dealing with this in any adult way at all. But what I was going to say is, it seems like with even with GI Jane, I remember Viggo Mortensen is in that movie. He plays like a brutal
Right.
guy that's like super abusive. There was the thought, along with Don't Ask, Don't Tell, that like the military is this reactionary institution. It's homophobic, it's
Yes.
misogynist, it's entirely about constructing masculinity in this incredibly violent and dominating way. What are women and
Exactly.
gay people doing in this place at all?
Yeah.
And
Why
that
would you
seems
want
like
to be there?
part of what we were thinking about in the 90s too.
I
I don't
agree.
have an answer for that because it's hard. Yeah.
It is hard. And it's a pivotal decade that I'll be honest, I haven't closely examined it, but those are those moments I think of are those instances, the Gulf War and GI Chain and Don't Ask, Don't Tell.
it's part of that part of a longer, I guess, a longer discourse about exactly what you're describing, which is sort of like what role do women play in the U.S. military? What was the Reagan administration's overall attitude about that? I mean, do we know?
They were just not interested in it. That's
Yeah.
my general takeaway. That was, I kind of glanced at a few things, but moving pause was like the big heart of it. They couldn't kick the women out, but they weren't going to do any pushes for recruitment. I think the 80s, they were also kind of struggling just to get men in the military in general, too, as the aftermath of Vietnam. Um, so they're just kind of like, we're just not going to worry about the women and we're not going to talk about them. I haven't talked to a lot of veterans from that period. I talked to one woman who had a daughter while she was there, and like they didn't have things like they had no provisions for childcare, for example. Like you cannot take your child anywhere for no childcare will take them for 6 weeks. So what do you do in that time? Um, so I think that's when we start to see if they start letting women have children and serve in the 70s, by the 80s, the few women who are in are grappling with those questions of how do I raise a family? And we're still grappling with those questions today. And the military is still addressing issues of, oh, hey, how do we handle physical training tests for women who are postpartum? And, oh, how do we have facilities for nursing mothers? And what does this mean? And what does this mean? It takes
Mhm.
a long time to have those conversations, apparently.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think about sort of like the relationship between um, that evolution of women in the U.S. military happening alongside the evolution of women in U.S. corporations and in
Yes,
kind of in sort of the larger business world, because it seems like that was part of.
I think
I'm
so.
sorry, I keep bringing up my childhood because the
No, I'm with
images,
you.
yeah, of like Melanie Griffith in Working Girl, and
Yes,
like that sort of thing. It seems like these things were happening in a parallel way, and yet
I
Melanie
think
Griffith's
they were.
character in Working Girl is not really looking towards the military. They're like separate
No,
spheres so much. Yeah,
I think so. And maybe it comes back to that class difference too, right?
right.
Like you're pointing out that um, maybe the people who are writing the films and thinking about American audiences are not really thinking through. And if they're going to put somebody in the military in a film, probably not going to put a woman in there unless it's Goldie Hawn doing something funny.
Well, there's also like a movie about an administrator, right? Like for
Yeah,
so long, like you're talking about, if you're going to make a movie about someone in the military, there it better be like it better be some, all the sort of familiar things we think about with the
true.
military.
Yes.
If it's office work, if it's, I mean, isn't it crazy? I can't think of. I mean, maybe it exists, but I can't think of a movie about like army nurses or military. Like,
No.
where is that movie?
Now, China Beach did have, we did it in
Yeah,
TV. And I
yep.
really haven't seen much China Beach because I didn't watch it as when it was on the air as a kid. And I saw a couple after the fact. So China Beach dealt with it. MASH, of course, but that's over by the mid 80s. I'm just remembering that A Few Good Men does, it's another Demi Moore
Oh
movie.
yeah,
Um,
right. Wow.
she's a lieutenant commander in the JAG, the legal offices, but that's 1992. So Demi Moore in the military had a good decade, didn't they?
Yeah, seriously, it makes me curious now. I'm like, what was going on with that?
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Why did Demi Moore do two military movies? That's really interesting.
Well, I mean, I guess, I mean, in a sense, there's a pop feminism going on there
Yeah.
in one way or another. I mean, she's also like the
True.
sexy girl, like there's many layers going on
Yes.
there. God, it's such an incredible topic. Before you go, I want to ask you a little bit about teaching high school, because it's something
Yeah.
we've taught about. I mean, we think of a lot about the sort of becoming an academic, or getting a PhD in this era, because I didn't get a full-time tenure track job, and I've been adjuncting and barely doing that anymore. And it seems like the high school path is a very particular one. How you don't have to tell your whole life story. I don't want to put you on the spot, but how's it been for you?
It's been perfect for me. I was very, very fortunate. When I finished my degree in 2011, I had a friend who had actually come to this school. She's my department chair now. She left the program before me, and it happened that year they had an opening in history. And I was very fortunate. The assistant head of school at the time was a history PhD who had had the same path. And for me, it's been wonderful. I'm in a place that has a lot of collaboration, a lot of opportunity for creativity. I'm a team leader for the ninth grade, so we do a lot of creating together. It's been great. So, like, our ninth grade class is the post 1900 world, which, as somebody who studies the Cold War, we did a lot of Cold War, but also it gives me stuff that I don't know. So, I'm always learning something. And then, of course, I teach US history as well. So I've gotten to teach all sorts of great things here. So, it's intellectually fulfilling. It's always interesting, and it's been a supportive environment. You know, I've been able to, get my book going. That was the most
Yeah.
important thing. I was like, I want to do my book, and I'm really, really happy here. It's been great.
Well, congratulations on the book, because
Thank
it caught my attention. It's such an awesome topic, and it's one that I think people should know a lot more about. I want to say the name of it before we go again. It's called Her Cold War: Women in the U.S. Military, 1945 to 1980. Tanya Roth, thank you so much for talking with me. This was fun.
Oh, thank you, David. I really enjoyed this.